The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got back from my morning walk. I hadn't put it there. My daughter-in-law had a key she'd asked for 2 years ago, said it was just in case. I picked up the envelope, turned it over in my hands, and felt something cold settle in my chest. It was from a law firm in Toronto. Not my lawyer, someone else's. I set it back down without opening it. Then I put the kettle on, sat in my chair by the window, and watched the birch trees in my backyard sway in the October wind. I'd lived in this house in Barrie, Ontario for 31 years. My wife Margaret, no, I won't use that name. Too many stories use that name. My wife Eleanor had picked out those birch trees herself. She'd planted them the spring our son was born. He was 43 years old now. Those trees were 43 years old. And someone had left a legal envelope on my kitchen table without my permission. I'm Harold Sutton. I'm 70 years old. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer with the same firm in Barrie, and I retired at 68 with a clean record, a good pension, and a house that was paid off in full. No debt, no mortgage, just a 4-bedroom home on a corner lot that the city had assessed at just over $900,000 the previous spring, mostly because the neighborhood had changed around me, and suddenly everyone wanted to live near the lake. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a frail man. I am not confused. I do not forget things. I walk 5 kilometers every morning regardless of the weather. I read 2 books a month. I do my own taxes. I cook my own meals. And I have never once, not in 70 years, needed someone to make a decision for me. I say this not out of pride, but because what my son and his wife attempted to do was built entirely on the assumption that I was none of those things. They needed me to be diminished, and I was not. My son's name is Trevor. He's the kind of man who has always been very good at appearing reasonable. When he was a teenager, he could talk his way out of almost anything, and I used to think that was a skill. Now I know it was a warning. He married his wife Diane 8 years ago. I tried to like Diane. I genuinely tried. She's from a family in Mississauga, good-looking woman, sharp dresser, and she has a way of framing everything she wants as something she's doing for you. I noticed that about her, early. I never said anything. Eleanor would have wanted me to try. Eleanor passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I will not say much about that because it is not the story I'm telling, except to say that after she died, the house changed in a way I hadn't expected. It didn't feel empty so much as it felt very large. I rattled around in it. I took up woodworking in the garage because I needed somewhere for my hands to go. About 8 months after Eleanor died, Trevor started calling more often. I was glad at first. I thought grief had reminded him that time was short. He'd call on Sunday evenings, ask how I was doing, ask if I needed anything. He and Diane came for Christmas that year, and for the first time in a long time it felt like a family. I cooked a turkey. We played cards. I let myself believe something good was happening. The first real comment came in February, about 14 months after Eleanor's passing. Trevor had come up from Toronto alone. Diane was at something with her sister, and we were having dinner at my kitchen table, the same table where that envelope would sit 4 years later. He'd looked around the room and said, almost casually, "Dad, this place is a lot to keep up. Have you thought about maybe simplifying things?" I asked him what he meant by simplifying. "Well," he said, "the yard, the upkeep, the stairs. You're not getting younger." I told him I walked 5 kilometers a day and had just recalked the entire upstairs bathroom myself. He laughed and said I was incredible for my age. I noticed he'd said for my age. I didn't say anything. Over the next several months, the conversation kept returning, not always directly. Sometimes it was an article he'd text me about senior-friendly communities in Simcoe County. Sometimes it was Diane mentioning, over the phone, that her own father had moved into a condo and how much happier he seemed. Sometimes it was just Trevor asking, with what sounded like genuine concern, whether I was managing okay with everything. I told him every time that I was managing fine. He always said he was glad. He always found a way to bring it up again. In the spring of the following year, Trevor was 41 by then. I was 68. Retired 8 months, he told me about the business. He and a partner had been running a property management company for about 5 years, and apparently things had gone wrong. The partner had been mismanaging funds. There were debts. He said the number carefully, like he was setting something fragile down on a table. $480,000. I asked him what kind of timeline he was working with. He said they needed to restructure within the year, or the whole thing would collapse. I asked him what he needed from me. He said he didn't need anything from me. He was just keeping me informed. But he said it in a way that left space in the air. And I have been an engineer for 38 years, and I know when someone has designed a structure with a particular load-bearing point in mind. I told him I was sorry to hear about the business. I told him I hoped it worked out. And that night, after he'd driven back to Toronto, I sat in my garage with a half-finished cedar chest, and I thought about the fact that my house was worth $900,000, that I lived alone, that my son needed money, and that for the past 18 months he had been very gently and persistently suggesting that this house was too much for me. I called my friend and former colleague Dennis Warkentin the next morning. Dennis had retired 2 years before me and had gone on to work part-time as a legal consultant. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew lawyers, and more importantly, he knew how to think about problems the way I did systematically. I told him what I'd told you. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about Dennis. When I finished, he said, "Harold, I think you should talk to an estate lawyer." "This week," I said. "That's what I was thinking." "And Harold," he said, "don't tell Trevor you're doing it." I didn't. The lawyer I found was a woman named Patricia Howe, a partner at a firm in Barrie who specialized in estate planning and elder law. I spent 2 hours in her office that first visit. I told her everything I've told you. And she asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself about whether Trevor had ever asked me to sign anything, about whether I had any joint accounts, about the property title, about my will. I answered everything. By the end of that meeting, I had a very clear picture, and Patricia had a very clear picture, and neither picture was comfortable. She explained to me the concept of a fraudulent conveyance, the act of transferring or selling an asset in a way designed to defeat a legitimate owner's rights. She explained what a power of attorney was and what it could be used for if someone had one and decided to misuse it. She explained the importance of making sure any such documents were current, correctly witnessed, and held by someone I trusted completely. Trevor did not have power of attorney over me, but he had been asking me, on 3 separate occasions over the past year, whether I'd updated my paperwork since Mom passed. I had told him each time that everything was in order. It was true, but I'd said it to close the conversation, not because I'd actually reviewed anything recently. Patricia and I spent the next 6 weeks putting my affairs into a structure that was, to use her word, airtight. I established a living trust. The house was transferred into the trust. I was the trustee. Patricia held copies of all documentation. My financial accounts were reviewed and secured. My will was updated. A new, limited power of attorney was drafted that specified very clearly what decisions it covered and did not cover, and it was held by Patricia and by Dennis, not by any family member. I want to be clear about something. I was not doing this because I believed Trevor was definitely planning something. I was doing it because the pattern of behavior I had observed over the past 18 months was consistent with a specific kind of risk. And I was an engineer, and engineers do not ignore structural vulnerabilities simply because the structure hasn't collapsed yet. Around this time, I also had a camera system installed in my home. 2 exterior cameras, 1 interior camera in the front entryway. This was not a dramatic move. Many people my age in Ontario have cameras for practical reasons. I mentioned it to Trevor casually when he called the following Sunday. He said it sounded like a good idea. Over the following months, things seemed to settle. Trevor still called on Sundays. He and Diane came for Thanksgiving. The business, he said, had found a path forward, some restructuring, a new arrangement with the creditors. He seemed less stressed. I let myself wonder if I had been overcautious. Patricia reminded me, at our check-in in January, that overcautious was not a condition she had ever seen harm anyone. Then in March, Trevor called and mentioned that a colleague of his, a developer he'd worked with on a project in Vaughan, had expressed interest in properties in the Barrie area. Waterfront adjacent lots, specifically. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my street might fall into that category. I said, He said, "I'm not suggesting anything, Dad. Just thought it was interesting." I said, "It is interesting." 3 weeks later, he asked me if I had ever considered what I might do with the proceeds if I ever did sell. I said I hadn't given it much thought. He said the market was extraordinary right now and I should think about it. I said I would. I called Patricia the next morning. In April, Diane called me, not Trevor, Diane, to tell me that she and Trevor had been doing some research and had found a beautiful retirement community in Collingwood, about 45 minutes from Barrie. Very nice, she said. Independent living, not assisted living. She was very specific about that. She'd take me to see it if I was interested. She mentioned that a unit had just come available, and these things went quickly. She said all of this with the warm, efficient concern of someone who had been practicing the speech. I told her I would think about it. I wrote down the date and time of the call. I sent Patricia an email that afternoon summarizing the conversation word for word as best I could remember it. In May, Trevor asked me to come to Toronto for the weekend. He wanted to take me to dinner, show me a project they were working on near the waterfront, just spend some time together. I went. The dinner was at a good restaurant, and Trevor was warm and funny, and it felt, sitting across from him, like talking to the boy I had raised. I let myself enjoy it. I also noticed that at one point during dinner, he slid a piece of paper across the table and said it was just a general authorization form his accountant needed, something to do with the estate restructuring he was still working through, and could I just sign at the bottom? I picked it up. I read it. It was not an accountant's form. It was a general power of attorney document, drafted to give Trevor broad authority over my financial and property decisions. It was not the limited, specific document Patricia had described to me. It was the other kind. I set it down. I looked at my son. He was watching me with an expression I can only describe as careful. I said, "I'll have my lawyer look at this before I sign anything." He said, "Dad, it's just a formality. The accountant needs it before the end of the month." I said, "Then we'd better get it to my lawyer quickly." I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. Trevor's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I drove home to Barrie the next morning and brought the document to Patricia's office before lunch. She looked at it for about 45 seconds and then looked up at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone whose concern has just been confirmed. She made a copy. I kept the original. We talked for 2 hours about next steps. Over the following 6 weeks, Patricia and I did something I want to explain carefully, because it matters. We did not confront Trevor. We did not warn him. We did not change our behavior toward him in any visible way. What we did instead was construct what Patricia called a documentary record, a clear, time-stamped, thoroughly evidenced account of every approach Trevor and Diane had made regarding my property and finances, every document I'd been asked to sign, every conversation, every phone call I had notes on. We also retained a private firm to conduct a title search, which revealed something Patricia had suspected. Trevor had, on 2 occasions in the previous 6 months, made inquiries with the Provincial Land Registry Office regarding the process for transferring a property title in cases involving an elderly owner with a POA. He had not done anything yet, but he had been researching how to do it. I want to tell you how I felt during this period. I have thought about it many times, and the honest answer is, mostly steady. There was grief in it. Yes, not sharp grief, but the low, heavy kind that comes from accepting something about a person you love that you had been hoping wasn't true. I had built a career on the principle that a structure's integrity is either sound or it isn't, and that hoping it was sound was not the same as knowing it was sound. I had applied that same thinking to my son, and the results were not what I had wanted, but I was not undone by it. I was 70 years old, and I had buried my wife, and I had outlasted a lot of things. I went on my walks. I worked in my garage. I made my calls to Patricia and Dennis. I had dinner with my neighbor Frank Kellerman on Thursday evenings because Eleanor and Frank's wife Rosemary had been close and the tradition had continued. On a Tuesday in September, just over 2 years after Trevor had first mentioned simplifying things over dinner, I received a phone call from a real estate agent I had never spoken to before. He introduced himself, said he was calling on behalf of a client who had expressed interest in my property and asked if I would be available to discuss a potential private sale. He mentioned the address. He mentioned a figure. He was friendly and professional, and he had no idea, I'm certain, that anything was wrong. I asked him the name of his client. He paused. Then he said the client preferred to remain anonymous at this stage, but had authorized him to proceed with preliminary discussions. I thanked him for calling and said I'd be in touch. I hung up and called Patricia. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harold, I think we need to move." We already had a plan. We had had a plan for 8 months. What Patricia meant was that it was time to begin executing it. I called Trevor that evening. I kept my voice exactly the way it always was, warm, a little tired from the day, slightly distracted. I told him I'd been thinking about his suggestions, and about Diane's suggestion regarding Collingwood, and that maybe he was right that it was time to think about the future seriously. I said I was planning a trip to visit my sister in Halifax for 2 weeks, and that when I came back maybe we could sit down together and talk about options. Trevor's voice changed immediately. It got lighter, more open, the way a person sounds when a door they've been pushing against finally gives way. He said that sounded wonderful. He said he and Diane would have some thoughts to share. He said it in a way that told me the thoughts were already fully formed. I said, I'll leave my spare key with the neighbor in case anything comes up while I'm away. He said, actually, Dad, we could just hold on to our copy in case you need us to check on the house. I said that was probably a good idea. 2 days later I drove to the airport, made sure Trevor's car. I had recognized it from the exterior camera footage the previous week. He had driven by twice, was not visible on my street, and I caught a flight to Halifax. I did not leave my spare key with the neighbor. I did not tell Trevor this. What I did do was leave my car in the long-term parking lot at Barrie's bus terminal, rather than the airport, because I had taken the airport shuttle. If anyone looked, my car was not at the airport. My car was at the bus terminal. It would appear I had gone elsewhere. This was a small thing, a deliberate small thing, and it mattered in a way I'll explain. My sister Carol lives in Halifax with her husband. I had actually been planning to visit anyway. This was not invented, and I stayed for 10 days, which were largely pleasant. I walked along the harbor in the mornings. I called Patricia every 3 days. On the 8th day, Patricia called me. She told me that 3 days earlier, Trevor and Diane had entered my home using their key. The interior camera had captured them. Over the course of 4 hours, they had photographed every room, measured what appeared to be the principal rooms, and removed from my home office filing cabinet a folder of documents. The camera could not read the contents, but I knew what was in that cabinet. I had left it there intentionally. What Trevor did not know was that those documents, the ones that appeared to be my original property title, my will, and several financial account summaries, were copies. Precise copies, same paper, same printer, same fonts. The originals were in Patricia's office. The copies looked entirely real. They were designed to. On the 9th day, Patricia received a call from a real estate lawyer in Toronto she did not recognize, asking about the process for completing a title transfer on a Barrie property, referencing an address that was mine. The lawyer, who had clearly not been told the full picture by his client, was asking routine questions. Patricia answered them, noted the name of the firm, and made a record. On the 10th day I flew home. My key didn't fit the lock. I stood at my own front door on a cool September evening with my overnight bag at my feet and tried my key 3 times before I understood that the lock had been changed. I stepped back. I looked at my house. The lights were on inside. Through the front window I could see movement. I took out my phone and I called my son. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Trevor, I'm at the house. There seems to be a problem with my key." There was a pause. Then he said, "Dad, I'm glad you called. We need to talk." I said, "I'm listening." He said, "Diane and I have been worried about you for a long time. You know that. And we made a decision. I know you're going to be upset, but we made it because we care about you. We've arranged to have the house listed. There's a buyer ready. It's a private sale, very clean. And the proceeds are going to be set aside for your care. You're going to be comfortable, Dad. We found you a beautiful place in Collingwood." I stood on my own porch in the September dark, and I listened to my son explain, in a calm and reasonable voice, that he had sold my house. I said, "I see." He said, "I knew you'd be upset, but you'll understand eventually that this was the right." I said, "Trevor, who signed the title transfer?" There was a longer pause this time. He said, "We had the documents, the ones from your office, and we had the POA." I said, "I never signed a power of attorney, Trevor. You put a document in front of me at dinner in May, and I said I'd have my lawyer look at it. I kept that document. My lawyer has it. I never signed it." "Silence," I said. "And the title to this house is held in a living trust that was established 18 months ago. It cannot be transferred by anyone other than the trustee, who is me, with documentation held by my lawyer. The documents in my filing cabinet were copies. The sale your buyer thinks he's buying cannot be completed because the seller has no legal authority to sell it. I could hear him breathing. Then, very quietly, he said, "Dad." I said, "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to retain a lawyer. A good one." And I hung up. I sent a text to Patricia. It said, "They moved. Everything happened as expected. You can proceed." She had already been on the phone with the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit for 40 minutes. She had the camera footage, the title search records, the copy of the unsigned POA, the records of Trevor's land registry inquiries, the real estate lawyer's call log, the real estate agent's initial call to me, and a 26-page documented record of every interaction over the preceding 2 years. I called Frank next door. He came over with his spare key, the real one, which I had left with him, and let me into my own house. I made tea. I sat in my chair. The birch trees were nearly bare by then, just a few yellow leaves still holding on. I had planted those trees with Eleanor in the spring of 1982. They had stood through 43 Ontario winters. They were not going anywhere. Trevor and Diane retained a criminal defense lawyer within 24 hours. The charges that were ultimately filed included fraud over $5,000, attempted theft, unauthorized use of a dwelling, and breach of trust. The real estate agent cooperated fully once the situation was explained to him. He had been told by Trevor that he held valid authorization to sell. The buyer, a developer from Vaughan, was notified that the sale was void and was not a party to the fraud. He was understandably furious with Trevor. The court process took 14 months. I will not recount every detail because some of it is still difficult and some of it is simply tedious, and I do not want to stand here and pretend that watching your only son cross-examined about why he tried to steal your house is something you can reduce to a story with a clean ending. It is not. Some things are true and painful at the same time. What I will tell you is the outcome. Trevor received a conditional sentence of 22 months to be served in the community under strict supervision, with conditions that included no contact with me for 3 years, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution of all costs. I incurred legal fees, security costs, the cost of the camera system. Diane received a shorter conditional sentence and a separate civil liability judgment that she and Trevor are still paying off. Their property management company dissolved. The business debt that had started all of this, the $480,000, turned out to be significantly larger than Trevor had told me. The real figure, which came out in the proceedings, was closer to $720,000. That was what my house was for. That was the number behind all of it. I still live in this house. I walked this morning, 5 kilometers, along the Lakeshore Trail, where the ice is starting to form at the edges. I am 70 years old, and I am not frail, and I am not confused. I had my annual physical last week, and my doctor, who is a sensible woman who does not flatter her patients, told me I was in excellent health for a man of any age. I have a cedar chest in my garage that I finished over the winter. It's the best piece of woodworking I've ever done. I think Eleanor would have liked it. Dennis came for dinner last Friday. We talked about retirement, about his grandchildren, about a documentary we'd both watched. At one point he said, "You know what I've been thinking about, Harold? The fact that you started talking to a lawyer almost 2 years before anything actually happened. If you'd waited, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I've thought a lot about what I want people to take from this. Not as a lesson I don't enjoy being lectured to, and I assume you don't either, but as something I found to be true in my own experience. Your instincts about the people around you are usually correct. When someone who loves you begins to treat your independence as a problem to be managed, pay attention to that. You do not need to be in crisis to protect yourself. You do not need to wait until the lock has been changed before you call a lawyer. The time to review your estate documents, to understand what a living trust is, to know who holds your power of attorney and what it authorizes that time is long before you need it. Preparation is not paranoia. It is self-respect. Being old does not make you a burden. It does not make you a resource. It does not make your home, your money, or your dignity available to anyone who decides they need them more than you do. You built your life. You are entitled to live in it. And if someone puts an envelope on your kitchen table without your permission, put the kettle on, sit in your chair, and think very carefully about who you're going to call. Then call them.